So what was everyday life like during the Cold War? Well, one of the biggest things that had to be addressed was when the veterans from World War II came home, what were they going to do? What jobs were they going to have since the women had taken the factory jobs? How were they going to adjust to life in America? So Congress, and now we're back to President Truman being in charge, they had to work together to try to figure out some of these answers. So what's going to happen is Congress is going to take steps to prevent another Great Depression from happening. They wanted to make sure there was enough work for the men who returned home from the war, as well as women if they wanted the jobs, although they were highly encouraged to not continue to work. Um, so one of the first things that Congress is going to do is they're going to pass what's called the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, which today we just simply refer to as the GI Bill. And what the GI Bill did was that it gave money to veterans after you'd done a certain number of years with the military in order to help them to get a start in terms of business, to buy homes, to buy farms, or to attend college if that's what they wanted. So this is going to lead to a huge number of Americans, in particular, going to college for the first time ever. And the GI Bill is still around today. So after you've done, I think it's like 4 years, you do get some money to help you to pay for your college education. And so here you can see guys being like, yay, I got myself the GI Bill. Yay. Congress is also going to pass the Employment Act of 1946. And the Employment Act of 1946 creates the Council of Economic Advisors, whose job it was to help find the veterans jobs that they were going to be able to perform. I mean, you've got to remember, some of these guys are coming home missing limbs, blind, deaf, these types of tragedies, and they have to learn how to do these new jobs. Plus, jobs had changed from the time they had been in the war. You know, it went from a farming society, then the Dust Bowl, and the Great Depression had set in, so people were poor and they didn't have very many opportunities for work, to now, all of a sudden, factories had boomed, but specifically to make weaponry for the war. That was no longer needed, so what was going to happen instead? So what the main thing they did was that they took the factories that had primarily been responsible for making weaponry, and those now made consumer goods, televisions, furniture for the house, toys, these types of consumer-based products, which is going to completely change the face of the American economy. Finally, we become an economy that's based on stuff. The more stuff you have, the better. That became the mentality. However, there were other factories that produced regular, food, and other types of clothes and those types of assistance things that were needed that we could send to our friends in Europe and Asia as part of the Marshall Plan. And this is a really confusing graph, but it just shows that the economy got better. So just go with that. They did have to address, the relationship with women. There were a lot of tensions because jobs were, factory owners in particular, were encouraged to give veterans the jobs and fire non-veterans. They wanted to basically as a sign of thank you for doing your service for your country. However, when you had Rosie the Riveter who was telling women, hey, your service for your country is to go out and work, and now you're telling women go home and stay in the kitchens and make your husband's food, it was a conflict of interest that some women struggled with. Congress is also going to abolish the Fair Employment Practices Committee. This had been a group that had helped to protect African Americans from discrimination in the workplace. So by abolishing this, a lot of minorities are going to face difficulties in terms of finding and keeping jobs. Rosie the Riveter was retired. This was no longer a propaganda or political, whatever you want to term it, campaign that was used because women were encouraged to quit their jobs and give those jobs to the men. If they didn't do so willingly, in many instances, the women were flat out fired from their jobs. One of the biggest things, though, was that inflation was relatively high. There was a huge surplus in terms of the amount of just goods that were available, consumer-based goods. The problem was that this happened at a time when price controls were lifted, particularly in meat and other foods. During the war, there had been caps, like levels set to make sure that prices didn't get too out of hand so everybody could afford stuff. Once those were lifted, the companies that manufactured these goods and services started to charge whatever they wanted. and wages had not yet increased to keep up with that. And so there was this really high inflation where there was this discrepancy between what could be afforded and the wages that people earned. As a result, millions of workers are going to wind up going on strike, trying to fight to either get wage increases or price controls established, one of the two. That way they could afford these new consumer goods. In terms of labor unions, President Truman himself actually supported unions. He liked that they were able to be formed to keep the workers safe and to make sure that they weren't being treated badly. That being said, he did not like when unions went on strike. This disrupted the economy, particularly railroads. This is one that he focused on. When railroad workers would go on strike because they thought they were being treated poorly or they weren't making fair wages, it disrupted trade, which hurt the economy even further because goods weren't able to go across country, and so the prices on those goods were really, really high in other areas. So in order to deal with these strikes, Truman's going to wind up ordering the military, the U.S. military, to come in and put down some of these revolts, sometimes using violence, particularly against coal miners, for example. And this is going to make him have a relatively bad reputation because he was using force against people who were trying to look out for the well-being of workers. He threatened a whole bunch of other unions, if you don't stop using strikes or if you don't stop using force, then I will continue to use force in order to have my way. So it's going to try to push unions to negotiate instead of use flat-out strikes as a means of protest. In 1947, Congress is going to pass the Taft-Hartley Act, and what this did is it actually allowed the judiciary branch to step in to end some of the strikes. And so the judicial branch is now going to sit here and determine whether the strikes were fair or unfair, and whether the military putting down strikes was fair and unfair. And the other thing that the Taft-Hartley Act does is that it outlaws closed shop agreements. Essentially, a closed shop agreement is those companies where you have to be in the union. You have to be a member of the union in order to work there. And Taft-Hartley is going to say, no, some companies should have the choice and employees should have the choice. And so it's just really going to call into question the structure of our economy and our relationship with the labor unions. The Taft-Hartley Act ultimately is going to weaken unions in general. Truman's going to veto the bill. He says, no, I don't think that this is necessarily the way that we should go about it. We're being a little too heavy-handed, but Congress is overriding him. And this makes him look exceptionally weak to the American people when his own Congress doesn't stand behind his statements. Republicans were happy. They said that this is going to start correcting some of the big government flaws that were created by FDR's New Deal. Liberals, though, say that this is bad because they like labor unions. And if unions are going to have a lot of restrictions on them, then they're not going to be able to effectively protect its workers. So now there's going to be resentment that's created between unions and non-unions. Organized laborers are going to work really hard to find loopholes around the Taft-Hartley provisions by creating, instead of a lot of little unions, they create big, powerful unions that become lobby groups that can go to Congress and push to have some more of their rights back. Most notably, the Union of Automobile Workers, or the UAW, which to this day continues to be a fairly strong, powerful union, particularly in Toledo. And here's just some of the propaganda around the Taft-Hartley. Civil rights was another issue that needed to finally be addressed. There were minorities who fought in World War II. When they returned home, they wanted to have equal rights because they too had risked their life for the well-being and democracy of America. The high inflation and labor unrest is going to actually create more separation between the races because, again, the minorities were often paid less or treated worse. And so Truman is going to stand pretty strong in terms of we need to address these issues. He wanted to try to correct some of the civil rights issues that existed within the country. One of the biggest was that the schools were still segregated. There were black schools, there were white schools, and then you went to the school that belonged, what race you depended on. And he thought that this was unfair. He also didn't like that employment was highly discriminatory. And so He is going to pass the Committee on Civil Rights in 1946. And this committee's job was to research civil rights across the country, realizing, he's a middle class white farmer in the middle of Missouri. What the heck does he know about civil rights and the black experience in America, for example? And so he's going to form this committee to investigate it. They're going to report back that there are huge civil rights abuses across the country, particularly lynching. He was appalled to find out that there were still lynchings going on in the South. And so he wanted to do something about it. One of the first things he's going to do is he's going to ask Congress to pass anti-lynching laws and anti-poll tax measures. Make it so that black people have more equal access to the voting system, for example. Poll tax, you had to pay a certain amount of money in order to vote, and very often it was a high amount that the minorities were not able to afford. He said that this was discriminatory. He also wanted to end discrimination in federal agencies, and he wanted to end discrimination in the military. Let's not have separate black and white troops. Let's put them all together into one. Most of these measures and pushes were ignored by Congress, however, and so he's going to just start issuing executive orders. He's going to basically flat out say, this is what's going to happen. I'm not going to go through Congress. Do what I say. I'm the president. Mostly towards this goal of ending discrimination. While this is obviously a very, very great and lofty goal, it is going to anger a lot of people in the South, which made it seem like he was going to struggle for his own election in 1948 because he was starting to isolate members of his own political party. So in 1948, he's going to run for president. Remember, he had taken the office when FDR had died, so 48 is his own attempt. It was not going to be an easy election for him. He pushed for a repeal of the Taft-Hartley Act. He asked for an increase in federal aid for housing, education, agriculture, broader security, Social Security benefits, and obviously civil rights as well. Now, a lot of different groups within the Democratic Party all threatened to leave. They're like, we're not going to sit here and vote for you to be our president, because mind you, this is at the Democratic convention. It's not the actual general election, it's the primary. We're not going to vote for you if you keep this stuff up. And there was a little bit of strong-handed tactics at the convention that basically said, you need to vote for him. He is our president. Let's stick with it. And so what winds up happening is that at this convention, a lot of the other factions within the Democratic Party, they're going to go ahead and agree. They'll vote for him. So they wind up voting for Truman to be their president, and then when they leave the convention, they go and they create their own political party. One was called the States' Right Party, or what we call the Dixiecrats. These are going to be guys who don't like his stance on civil rights, and they're going to be chaired by the South Carolina Governor, Strom Thurmond. So they vote for him, then they leave, they create their own party, and they put Strom Thurmond up against Truman. And this just shows that. And then the other group is the Progressive Party. This was going to be headed up by Henry Wallace. He left the Democrats, founded the new Progressive Party, and they're going to call for an extension of the New Deal, as well as improving relationships with the USSR, and looking at some of Truman's reactions with labor. So basically, the Democratic presidential ticket was split three ways: Truman, Thurmond, and Wallace. So it seemed evident that the Republican candidate, New York Governor Thomas Dewey, and his vice president, California Governor Earl Warren, would most likely win the election. And almost every presidential poll at the time said that this was going to be the case. However, Truman campaigned really, really hard, and he was ultimately able to win the election. It was a narrow victory with the popular vote, pretty solid with the Electoral College vote. You can see he won 303 to Dewey's 1989. Pretty famous picture up here. Most newspapers the night before the results came out published that Dewey had won before the election actually had been counted. And so that newspaper is the Chicago Tribune announcing Dewey defeats Truman, although it turns out that Truman actually won the election.